Hey, good morning. This is welcome back to another Maryland 250 podcast of labor history. And we're excited today to have Shawn Gladden. And Shawn is a museum professional, a historian, a lecturer, and unfortunately a refugee from the state of Maryland, where he lived for many years and is now in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
But we're going to be talking today about an intriguing and exciting work experience and organizing experience at the Baltimore Harbor, and that is the Caulkers. And you may have some experience in the Caulkers if you've read anything by Frederick Douglass, because he was one. But I'm going to turn it over now to Shawn. Welcome. And tell us about the labor history of the harbor and the Caulkers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bill. This is a topic that I got interested in while I was the director of the Fells Point Maritime Museum back in the early 2000s. And it was one of those topics that, a few scholars had looked at, but pulling all the pieces together into a more modern look is something that hadn't been done. And when I started looking at it, there had been some new work done, especially by a historian by the name of Frank Towers. But basically, the story starts. We start with African American enslaved African Americans who were enslaved by Maryland ship owners and ship carpenters and basically the shipbuilding industry, which was a huge business, a huge industry in Maryland and Baltimore and the Eastern Shore, going all the way back to the Revolution. Now, typically, on a ship dock, there are the diversification of various labor, and kind of the low job on the totem pole, so to speak, was caulking. And when we say caulking, what are we talking about? When we're talking about a wooden ship, we're talking about sealing the seams on wooden planks. The best place to see this done is at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. They used to do this demonstration. What they do is they take oakum, or basically twine, or some kind of a rope type mixture, and they dip it in tar, and then they take this tar twine, this tar-filled twine, and they put it in between each one of the seams on a ship. Now, theoretically, when you drop the ship into the water, the wood swells, and then that binds together and caulks and tightens, and air basically makes the ship airtight. This was considered to be one of the most difficult and dirtiest, nastiest jobs on the shipyard. And so, from a Maryland standpoint, which utilized obviously enslaved labor, it would make a lot of sense for those to relegate those unenviable jobs to your enslaved. However, it was a highly skilled position and obviously a very important job as part of the shipbuilding, because you need your ships to be watertight. So um, over time, and when I originally did this research, I brought in a number of different avenues. I looked at Ira Berlin, and really kind of looked at the Great Emancipation that occurred after the Revolution, where you saw many, especially in Maryland, many enslavers were manumitting their slaves, just kind of whether it's revolutionary fervor, whether the economics of slavery in this middle ground state didn't make sense anymore. For whatever reason, there's a period of time roughly about 1777 and 1810 where we see a rise in free African Americans who have been manumitted after the revolution. And how that manifests itself into the labor industry in Baltimore is that many of those who were enslaved, who had skills in the shipbuilding industry, came to Baltimore with these skills and were able to put themselves into the free labor market, and found that there was a need for ship caulkers. And interestingly enough, almost just by happenstance, the ship caulking guild kind of evolves by the 1830s. Your ship caulkers are making about $1.75 a day working independently on Baltimore docks, as opposed to many of the other manual trades were making $1 a day. So here they are by the 1820s and 1830s. they're they're so needed by the shipbuilding industry that their wages are obviously reflective of the skill and the necessity at the time. By 1838, the power of the colored caulkers is so immense, and so needed that they're able to organize. And you have evidence of the first Colored Caulkers Union, which is, and I've seen sources over the years have debated whether the first Caulker Union in Baltimore begins in 1833 or whether 1838. But we know by the 1830s there is a Caulkers Union. It's negotiating wages with the shipbuilding guild at the time, who were basically many of the wealthy ship owners. Some of the names we're probably familiar with in Baltimore history, the Kims and the O'Donnells and such. But these shipbuilders and this shipbuilding guild, they had kind of authorized or legitimized, if you will, the Colored Caulkers Union, and had even had such a hold on the trade that there were no white caulkers, there were no caulkers from outside of Baltimore that were coming in. Every ship basically caulked in Baltimore between 1838 and roughly 1858, which is when many historians say is kind of the golden age of these caulkers, were all caulked by members of the Colored Caulkers Union.
One of the things which I think was important, and you can also see a caulking demonstration at the Douglas Myers Museum down in Fells Point, but it is a skilled trade. And one of the things they talk about is that if you don't put enough caulking in, obviously the ship sinks.
Right.
If you put too much in, it becomes too buoyant
Mhm.
and is riding on top of the wave. So it's, again, we're looking at labor history, people developing skills and the whole ability of African Americans. And these are people who are either free blacks in many cases, and Baltimore was the center for the free black working class population, or self-hire slaves like Frederick Douglass, whose owner said, I don't have anything for you, go find a job.
Right.
And that's sort of the halfway between the manumission, where a slave owner figures, I can't afford to pay for this person year round. I'd rather hire them. And it's a great and rich history. And what we're seeing here on the screen is a depiction of the young caulkers working on the side of a ship. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, so go ahead. So talk about,
Mhm.
there was some racial conflict among the caulkers and in the harbor, and we're talking Fells Point.
Yeah, and bring up real quickly also the point that you talked about with Frederick Douglass. Something else, you had the Colored Caulkers Union, but that also benefited those who were, as you had mentioned, those who were hired out. As we know in Baltimore, as we should know, there were quite a few. If you were a even if you were enslaved like Frederick Douglass, you could hire out your services to different shipbuilders on along the wharfs of Baltimore. Now, part of your pay would go back to your master, but Frederick Douglass, as he said, "My bondage, my freedom." Being enslaved in Baltimore was almost like being free because of the freedom movement, and to some extent his freedom to work. Although obviously those are somewhat limited freedoms. But yes, what you're alluding to is the Caulker Wars of 1858 and 1859. Now, the interesting thing about this, when I first started looking at this, Bill, the newspaper called the Baltimore Sun back in 1858 and 1859 had two different headlines. They called this the War Amongst the Caulkers, and they also called it the Caulker Riots. And this is another example of how, you've got history, and once we look at the history, we get a little bit further explanation of what happened. So it was over a year and a half time span, but beginning really it started in 18. One could actually make the argument this downturn began in 1856. With the Panic of 1856, it significantly affected the Baltimore shipbuilding industry. So that guild that had been there and had pretty much been working side by side with the Colored Caulkers Union by 1856 and 1857 are starting to look for ways to save money. And they don't want to pay the high wages of the colored caulkers. So in 1858, they start bringing in Caulkers from outside of the state or outside of Baltimore. And in a lot of cases, this kind of coincides with the know nothing politics that were going on in Baltimore at the time, the anti immigrant politics, which also fueled the anti black politics at the time. And, Caulkers became kind of a target in 1858, 1859 because they had these great wages and pretty much 99% of the Caulkers in Baltimore are African American. So there were these nativist groups in Baltimore, famously the White Tigers, who were on the Federal Hill side of town, and they had kind of worked together with some of the more unsavory politicians to bring in what we would call scabs or folks that would come in and compete against the African American Caulkers, and their work was shabby, and that could be seen right away. And when the Shipbuilders Guild in Baltimore tried these other white tiger endorsed caulkers and they didn't work out. They went back to the colored caulker union, and those white tigers that were brought in to as scabs were now angry, and now they started going along the wharves of Federal Hill and Fells Point and just attacking any colored workers they could, namely the caulkers, because they were trying to break the monopoly that they thought the colored caulkers union had on the job. So that's the caulker riots, as they were called, the caulker war, the war amongst the caulkers. But I think we know, and the historian I mentioned earlier, Frank Towers, called it was a job busting operation, is really what it was. So
Yeah, I think that what we're going to see here in Maryland labor history is this whole racial issue. And
yeah,
Maryland is an unusual state because it was one of the first free black population. But when we talk later in the 1970s about the horrible divisions among the steelworkers at Sparrows Point, race is just an opportunity for the companies to try and set people fighting each other and not having the bargaining power and the leverage that they would if they showed some solidarity. But it's the same kind of issues we see today, not so much in Baltimore, but nationwide, of opposition to immigrants and antagonism to like Somalis and things.
right.
But this race issue in Maryland, starting at this point, is so important, and it's so great that you show it.
Yeah.
Um, so here's a copy of a kind of stuff. Can you see this on the screen? Okay.
Again,
All
yep.
right. And this is an example of a manumission record that Shawn was talking about for many slaves who were at places like Hampton, which is now a national park, national historical site, that it was not financially sound for a person to own a lot of slaves. And as agricultural changed, they would free them, not out of moral values, but just simply financial reasons. And the slaves, freed slaves, would then come to areas like Baltimore City because there was work here.
Mhm.
We will also see freed slaves going to East Towson, which has become a big issue. But the manumission records are kept here at Baltimore City Hall. And the issue was then you have to work. And one of the great stories in the Frederick Douglass autobiography was after he ran away and went to Massachusetts, when he had a job cleaning out a person's basement and they paid him. And when he was a caulker, he used to have to take his weekly paycheck and go home to the Auld family where he lived and give his money to his owner, who would then give him some small amount of money. He was in New Bedford and he realized this is mine to keep. So it was a real shift.
Yeah.
But one of the
Yep.
things that we did, another person, you want to talk about Isaac Myers?
Yeah, so I guess you could kind of say, the dust settles on the Caulker riots and the Civil War and what comes out of this. I guess you could say the legacy of the Colored Caulkers Union is Isaac Myers, who becomes in 1866, along with some other partners, opens up the Chesapeake Marine and Dry Dock Rail. The Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company, I believe that's what it is. But yeah, and Isaac Myers becomes a relatively successful African free, obviously after the Civil War freed, but the skills that he had learned and who he employed after the war. And I think, if I remember correctly, Isaac Myers was able to secure the kind of funding that enabled him to pay Caulkers a very, very good wage. I want to say it was almost $3 a day at one point at its which is double what it was just 10 years earlier. Um, so Isaac Myers, certainly is represents that the not only entrepreneurial spirit, African American entrepreneurial spirit for former enslaved persons, but I think he's a direct legacy from those who formed the Colored Caulkers Union and fought up to its end after it was broken after the Caulker riots of the late 1850s.
And obviously, Myers is so important that the museum in the city, which is a terrific place to go, is called the Douglas Myers Museum.
Yeah.
And this is a picture from the first colored union convention.
Mhm.
And these were black workers that were trying to organize after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And
And I think from a city that really celebrates its black entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, certainly the Reginald Lewis Museum is just around the corner from the Isaac Myers Frederick Douglass Museum. But Isaac Myers is cut from that cloth. I think that same kind of born from labor, but really utilize that entrepreneurial spirit and really utilize the skill set that he and some of his other colleagues had
yeah,
learned.
well, in some ways, not to get too far off the track, Frederick Douglass was exactly like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he ended up from going to be a slave to being a very wealthy guy, a property owner and a landlord. So it's a whole issue of social mobility. But I think
Yeah,
it's,
and
go
I
ahead.
think the fact that the museum is named after both Myers and
Yeah,
Douglas is apropos to that museum's mission.
but it's a
Although
great museum. It's about work, which is
it's about
different from most museums. And I think it's very, very important. This is a newspaper, the New Era, about the creation of the colored labor union. You can't always see it. Shawn was talking about the know nothings. And this is a cartoon which, from the time, shows the hostility. And you see clearly the Catholic and the Pope and everybody there um, coming to attack African American, and exactly the kind of thing today where people talk about the United States as a white country, as and natural, and it's embarrassing to hear people at the highest level of government talk about natural superiority.
right.
So, but you'll see then again, not to finish too much, but this was the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock down at Fells Point. And the Douglas Myers Museum is located in the spot where this was really set up. And it was such an improvement for Black workers to do. And it was, you'll see the whole social change after the war. But the original part of the working class history of the Caulkers. And you can see in detail, if you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography or if you read Tower's articles that we'll post here online, was a rich and complicated history.
I'll add one other thing to the Chesapeake Marine Railway and Dry Dock Company. I mean, I made this argument when I did my research 20 some years ago. I said, to some extent, what Isaac Myers was doing was he was doing a Henry Ford type operation
Yeah,
right here in Baltimore. I mean, he had kind of um, he had mechanized his dry dock operation to some extent, and he had cut out the wastes so much that he was able to pay his employees what would have been considered in
yeah.
1866 to 1868 a very nice wage, especially for African Americans. So that's another part of this with Myers that should be probably celebrated.
Okay, and what we've shown here is a couple pictures of the current museum. And one of the things we're going to try to do is a walking tour of Fells Point. One area that's important that we haven't talked about, which is a new history project in Baltimore, is the Caulkers House. And you wanted to give some background on that?
I mean, when I was doing my work, I was working for the Fells Point Maritime Museum, and I was working with the Preservation Society. But at that time, the two sisters' houses, as they were called, were dilapidated, and there was no real plan. So seeing what they've done in the last 15 years, and it's really impressive. I know they've used some of my work, some of Frank Tower's work, to do the interpretation in there, and it's a real gem of labor history and local history in Baltimore and Fells Point, that's for sure. And a great preservation project. What they've done there to rehabilitate that building is nothing short of miraculous.
And if you're in Baltimore, this is on North Wolf Street. It's just around the corner, 2 blocks from Thames, from the heart of Fells Point. What you see on the left is the opening, the announcement of the preservation and the renovation. That's Catherine Pugh, Izzy Cohen. And what you'll see, and then on the right is the museum as it looks today. And they have a great web page. They just posted some stuff about the Caulkers and the Caulker strike. Because this is where young black workers lived when they worked at the harbor. And the reservation project has gone through and dug up all the backyard. It found belt buckles and toys and all sorts of things that are signs of historical working class archaeology. And so it's a really a great project to try to go to if you haven't. And we're hoping to be able to get a working class walking tour here started. And again, to wrap up, this is the Douglas Myers Museum. You can see it at the
Right.
Fells Point, and it's a terrific area. So now let's see here. Okay, I didn't mean to cut everything out, but I think anything more that you want to talk about, I think because the thing that is so important as we look at Maryland labor history is this whole issue of race and skill and work, and it changes, and how workers adjust to it by organizing.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things we want to stress for workers today is that whatever good things we have came through this kind of self-help, this ambition. And one of the things we see in Frederick Douglass is both a combined collective organizing with the Caulkers, but individual social mobility. And these are the ways I call them door number one, door number two, door number three of how workers deal with bad situations. And door number one is they just accept it and complain about it and don't do anything. Door number two is as individuals, they get out of it. They find a better job, they move, they do things. And door number three is they organize. And that's what this whole labor history project is about. So,
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would, in studying this and looking at this specifically, I found this to be a really nice niche story about what it's like um, you know, to rise up socially with just a skill set,
yeah,
and how that skill set not only puts you on the map from a labor standpoint, but politically as well.
yeah,
So if you're looking for if you're looking for a story as America's in its early years of developing, capitalism from the revolution up into, through the antebellum period and then into the years after the Civil War. I mean, this is a great story from enslavement to dominating a trade. It's quite a story, and I think it's something that not only I think is important for America. I mean, it really tells the story of Baltimore and the maritime
yeah,
industry
yeah,
better than any individual story I can think of.
yeah.
So yeah.
And it's also a very important talk about organizing because a lot of times people think the union started in the 1930s, and really this was right after the War of Independence, and they came.
Yep.
So I want to thank Shawn. We're going to put some links up to his articles and to some of the other stuff, but we appreciate it very much.
My pleasure, Bill. Great to see you.